We're Adeche, he's Solomon.
And she's Adwoa.
And we make art and tell stories inspired by African mythology,
folklore,
culture, and history.
Can you tell me a little bit, maybe individually first? I assume you both were artists prior to becoming a couple. Can you talk a little bit about your individual journeys in art and then talk about how that kind of came together to form Adeche?
Okay.
Yeah, so I guess, we were both separate artists before we met. And we were both we did art for A-level and GCSE, but that was like the extent to which we kind of were taught art. But yeah, separately we were artists. I really liked doing illustrations and colorful paintings, and I always kind of had an aspect of my Ghanaian heritage in my work. So I used a lot of kente, which is the fabric we have in Ghana. And my work always depicted Black African women because growing up, there wasn't really many paintings like depicting women who looked like me, so Black women, and I wanted to kind of celebrate that through my art. So that was the type of artwork that I did personally.
I was really interested in photorealism, so that's trying to capture like the essence of a person, like almost like in the highest form of like realism as you could. Mostly specializing using like graphite and pencils. And the drawings that I did were mostly based on like powerful Black figures. So you have like Nelson Mandela, you'd have Martin Luther King, Nina Simone, those types of people, people who I believed were influential to the Black culture and experience, and really to celebrate Blackness.
Yeah, so I guess like individually we had already had that common ground of like celebrating Blackness through these figures. And yeah, that's actually really cool thinking about it now, that our artwork, even though it was very different visually, it still had that same theme. So yeah, that was really cool.
Yeah. So you guys meet, and how did African mythology come up? Was that something that you both loved already, or is that something you explored together within your relationship?
Great question.
So we met at an art exhibition. So we were both exhibiting our artwork in this exhibition. It was actually at uni, so it was like an ACS, which is Afro-Caribbean Society exhibition. And that's where we first met. And then we realized that we were studying the same course, which is architecture. So we had like a lot of shared common interests, and I think that's how we got along.
Yeah, that's how we got along. And then we started talking, and we got together, and then I guess so the way we started painting together first was so as I said, I used to focus only on like photorealism, really black and white drawings, and it hadn't been since like I don't know like A-level since I did anything colorful. And I remember telling Adwoa that I would love to explore more colors, like to paint a bit more, because I just hadn't done it before. So she literally goes out and buys a canvas, gets some paints, and then so she's like, okay, so we're having a sip and paint date night.
I love it.
It was so nice. And, like on that same day, like that same evening, she goes out and gets it. Yeah. She's like, okay, we're painting today. And so it was just really nice, really calm vibes, really chill when we're painting. And eventually we painted this one piece together. It was called like the Allure of Beauty, that we named it after. And so it was just this piece that we painted together using, our strengths, our weaknesses, the things that we're both interested in. And it created this beautiful piece. And we fell in love with the process of sort of like painting together.
So we just kept doing it, and then as we were painting, we were always kind of trying to celebrate our cultures, because I'm from Ghana and he's from Nigeria. But then within that, we both had an interest in mythology anyway. So Greek mythology, Norse mythology, like we loved Percy Jackson, that book series. Yes. We were heavy fans. But as we were trying to explore our culture through our shared artwork, we kind of were like, wait, is there any mythology or pantheons from where we're from Ghana, from Nigeria, or like throughout the continent? And we just found like a breadth of information, and we're like, oh my gosh, nobody knows anything about this. We didn't know anything about this. So as we were researching, we then took it upon ourselves to depict these deities and their folklore stories within our artwork, and that has kind of become like our sole mission. So every single one of our paintings has in some way some sort of inspiration to do with African mythology or folklore. Yeah,
honestly, something that really started off with just us trying to add a bit more depth to our paintings and sort of like inspiration. I sort of turned into this sort of like mission to learn more ourselves, but then also teach other people along the way. It's a very vulnerable journey where we're learning, we're able to depict these figures, folklore, stories because we're artists, which then enables people to visualize them and also be empowered by the thoughts of it as well.
That's so beautiful. I'll come back to the African mythology in a second, but I wanted to talk a little bit about working together. I understand, I mean, I'm not an artist, but I've been around a lot of artists, and I feel like artists can be very deeply personal, especially, you know, people feel very connected to their art and it's something that you're creating. So talk to me a little bit about how that dynamic was when you first started and what it's evolved into, especially as you started doing new art that both of you hadn't really done before, specifically African mythology. Like, how is that process? Like, is there ever a time where you're like, no, that's not going on there? Or like, how does that work? Especially because art can be so deeply personal and unique to the creator.
To be fair, I think we're kind of lucky because when we first started and we did that first painting, it was so relaxed, that the environment was really chill. We weren't like intentionally trying to paint together, so there was none of that, you know, stress or anxiety that comes with it. So it was just very free flowing, and it felt really natural. So we were like, oh my gosh, let's just keep going. So like as we were making more paintings, we kind of learned how to work together, especially like on the same canvas at the same time is not normal.
Right.
But I think it's like a really good form of communication for us and also bonding. So we really like enjoy that time together.
In a way it almost becomes like a sort of like a dance, sort of like it's a give and take, sort of action reaction, and what's really important to us, the way it works, because you know most artists can't do something like this, and it's mostly because you know art is something very deeply intimate to a person, and you have a lot of ego thinking I want it to go this way or that way, but in order to let this happen you kind of almost have to let your ego die. So it's not something that you can think of like, oh, this is my artwork now, and this is sort of Adwoa's artwork, or this is the part I'm doing, this is the part Adwoa's doing. It's one piece, and that's sort of also why we're one artist rather than saying, oh, you know, this is Solomon and Adwoa's piece. It's one piece instead, because that allows us to sort of create almost as one, and you know, we have a shared vision of what we want it to be, and then you sort of start the process of painting, and then you let it develop into what it wants to be in the end. And there's something incredibly freeing about that, sort of knowing that it would become whatever it sort of needs to become. You do your own, and then sort of like you react off someone else's sort of like additions to it, and then something that you might not have imagined would have been yourself becomes that's, you know, it's a new realm of possibilities. That's what we love about the process.
Yeah, and it sounds like a very beautiful process, especially being a couple. I can imagine that you know, creating something so beautiful together can be deeply healing as well, as you two do it together. So that's really beautiful. Can you talk us through, so you made your first piece, you started doing research on African mythology, realized there was a gap, right? Not many people know about it. Like we all learn about Zeus and all of these Greek, you know, gods, but nobody really knows about, you know, African mythology. So what was that process of research and then deciding, well, let's create this art, and then now you have a podcast. So what was that process like, and when did you really hone in and decide, like, let's do this, people need to see this?
So at first it was just a lot of fun, like discovering these deities and these stories, you know, like that had similar names to us, that were from the same like areas of the country as us and stuff like that, and it felt very personal. So it was really exciting to be able to discover that, and then also to like paint our depictions of that. But aside from that, we also realized that we weren't alone, and a lot of people didn't know the stories and didn't know the deities, especially people in the diaspora as well. So it kind of turned from like a fun little, oh, let's just paint these, to kind of us educating people as we're learning as well, which can be a lot of responsibility. But I think it's definitely needed, especially to break misconceptions and, you know, misrepresentations of a lot of deities and religions and spiritualities in Africa. So yeah, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I would just say that, you know, it really, you know, the way it first started was, you know, it was a very surface level where we started, you know, like, oh yeah, we've drawn, you know, painted this thing that it has sort of like an element of fire to it. And at first it was like, oh, what do we name this piece, or, you know, what should inspire this piece? And we're like, oh yeah, you know, fire, what do we know about fire, blah blah. You sort of like think about that, and then at first it was going to be something very like Greek mythology based, and then we thought, wait, no, do we not have something from our own culture that we can sort of relate to a bit more? And then you sort of do that research, you start thinking of like Shango, or you start thinking of like Anansi, and then you're like, oh wait, so there's these gods that we relate to that would be more personal for us to sort of like put into it, because then it's not just, oh, there's, you know, it's just sort of like fire. It's something that has history to it. It has meaning, something to do with, you know, our cultural worldview. And then, so once you start sort of doing that understanding, so it started very surface level, and then now the pieces that we do, you know, are steeped in like a lot of symbolism, are steeped with so much knowledge, storytelling, and all of these things adds this extra depth to our work that's empowering, because it means that people can learn so much more about our culture through it as well.
Yeah. So let's talk about the educational piece, because that is also a huge part of your platform. And that was honestly why I followed you the first time. I was like, what is this? This is so cool. What is African mythology? You know, for folks who are watching and, you know, maybe they've never heard of it, which honestly, a lot of people haven't, unfortunately. What is your definition of it, as I'm sure it's evolved from the first time you were researching it to now being so embedded in it? What is African mythology?
That's a great question. It's also a very, we can't answer it in one sentence. So in order to answer that question, we'd have to kind of break down, you know, the term African and the term mythology, because, you know, when we say African mythology, a lot of people kind of have the idea that, oh my gosh, you know, African is too broad, but that's just like the umbrella it's just the category in which we have to place all these pantheons and these stories. So, you know, when we talk about Africa, we're talking about, you know, 54 countries. Within those countries, we're talking about the tribes. We're talking about
different kingdoms, different empires, different cultures.
Yeah.
They all have different stories, different worldviews, different ways of explaining the world. And then that sort of then brings you towards what mythology is.
Yeah.
Mythology is just how a people sort of explained the world that they saw through stories, through myths.
Yeah.
And, you know, that can be a part of their, you know, core part of their religion. It can be part of, you know, their culture, their storytelling tactics. So those things are, you know, all part of how people sort of like explained the world.
Yes.
So when we talk about African mythology, we're sort of talking about, you know, how people around the continent explain and understood the world.
Yeah, and some of those thoughts they came up with informed their religion. Some of it informed their cultural practices.
Some evolved into their spiritual practices.
Yeah.
But, you know, at the core of it, there are these really interesting stories, because it's one thing to tell someone not to do something, or to tell someone to do something because of something, but pass it down in a better way. You normally have to weave it into a story to be able to explain it to your children, or to explain it to other people, to be able to, you know, so that it sticks into their head more. And that's sort of what mythology is. Mythology isn't exclusive to the African continent, but the times the African continent's mythologies have been missed out of like global narratives. And the reason why this is important for us to explore is that it sort of makes people think that people on the African continent didn't have complex worldviews before colonial times. Because if you think that everyone else, you know, Eastern Asian mythology, you have sort of European, Western mythology, all of these things sort of explain that lots of people had these complex thoughts that they were grappling with how the world worked, the meaning of life, the meaning of why the sky is this way. But if we never thought that people on the continent ever grappled with these questions, you sort of play into that thoughts that, oh, we were just, savages. We never thought about bigger than life questions, which is just plain wrong. So these stories are fundamental to understand.
Yeah, absolutely. And I totally agree with that, Solomon. And I think for me as well, like I said, following you and kind of diving deeper into African mythology, it also adds a lot of substance. And for folks that follow us that are in the diaspora that are not necessarily connected, to their homeland, I think it also serves as a sense of meaning, a sense of kinship of like, yeah, we do have, these stories and this life, that was unfortunately taken from us, but it existed, and your art is able to like bring that back to life. And I think that's what's so beautiful about it. And I want to talk a little bit about your art as a form of advocacy, right? And a lot of the creators that we talk to, whether they know it or not, their art does serve that purpose. And I think you're highly in tune with that purpose. So outside of obviously just creating really beautiful art, can you talk to us about what you hope your creations serve to the Black community, to the African community?
So we hope that our art serves as a way for people to feel empowered, because especially in the UK, if you go to a gallery or a museum, you won't see a lot that represents you. And we want our art to be that vehicle that, someone can look at it and be like, oh my gosh, I'm from Kenya and this kind of looks like my mom and I feel connected to it in this way. It's those little things that we really miss out on when we go to museums, we go to galleries, we miss out on that, cultural and personal connection. And we really hope our art can be that vehicle for people.
Yeah, I think so. Something that we frequently say is that in the same way, something like, Black Panther, it was such a big inspiration to a lot of the Black, communities globally. And that's because they could see themselves as a superhero. Now, we just think about what the impact it could be when you can start seeing yourself as gods, goddesses, deities, folklores, heroes that, are, these sort of, being able to put ourselves in these narratives, being able to see ourselves, in this light. I think it has a really profound, impact on both children growing up, because we didn't see a lot of that representation, but also adults and sort of like everyone. It's just being able to see yourselves as these things means that you can, imagine yourself as something larger than life, larger than yourself. And I think that's important, that it reflects us, because we've grown up seeing so much of what we think of God, or of what we think of, the highest form of power, not reflecting us. And if you think about it, the subtle or not so subtle damage that can do to a person's, sense of identity, if what you think of the highest form of power or the highest form of truth not looking like you, or not even be able to think about that, it's quite important. So us being able to present this sort of like different narrative, different visual representation, I think what we want is that people be able to see this, reflect on it, ask those questions, and also find solace and sort of like that impact and that representation through our art as well.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. And people are, right? I think you've the feedback that you've received has been great, and your platform is amazing. And I think people seeing yourself reflected in art, especially as you were saying, gods and goddesses, children. So I've heard a lot of discourse around how important it is, right, for little Black kids, little African kids to see themselves represented in something such as, gods and goddesses. And I know you have a podcast, and I want to talk a little bit about that and plug it a little bit for our audience. Can you talk a little bit about how the podcast started, and you're still building it? What are your hopes for it, and just what could people expect going and listening to your podcast?
Yeah, so our podcast started as just like a fun extension of what we were doing with our art, because when we first started started, we were like, okay, how do we tell these stories aside from like painting them? How can we actually like, you know, speak to people and tell them like from beginning to end this folk tale, or like go into more depth about a deity and stuff like that, and also our thoughts and opinions on them. So we were like, oh my gosh, let's just start a podcast. And then
I was just gonna say, because like literally before it was like we had to paint everything before we sort of like said what we were gonna say. They were like, no, this is too interesting. There's too much to learn and too much to say to have to sort of wait to finish a whole painting before we can tell people.
Because we were doing so much research and we were like, oh my god, that is so interesting. We'd love to paint it. Then we're like, oh my gosh, all these paintings are just stacking up and we can't finish them in time to like show people and explain about it. So the podcast was like the best way to share all the stories. And it's also going back to like, you know, the traditions of these stories being told orally. It just feels right as well to be saying these stories the way they were told hundreds and thousands of years ago.
And it was also a great way of us learning them ourselves, because so especially when the podcast started, because we had to do a lot of research for it. And you know what we did is that, you know, I'll do separate research, Adwoa will do separate research, and we'll tell each other on the podcast. We'll be reacting and learning about it, you know, live on the podcast. So it was always really interesting. It's like, as much as everyone else is learning, we're learning too. So that's sort of where it came about. So having that longer form time to properly digest and react and sort of learn about it in a really authentic and vulnerable way. Because you know, it deserves more than the 1 minute or 30 seconds social media platforms allow.
Absolutely. And that's so exciting. And for people who, you know, maybe want to learn more about African podcasts, you also give amazing book recommendations. I've read a couple. So can you talk a little bit about that journey as well? Because it seems like, you know, you have this mission and it's so multifaceted. You're doing the art, you're doing the podcast, you're reading these books and giving recommendations. Can you talk a little bit about that as well? Finding these really amazing books by really amazing authors and also giving them a platform through your platform.
So like through our research, we found a lot of books and they were just great. And one of the questions we were asked a lot on our social media platforms were, oh, do you have any book recommendations? Like, where can I learn about this more? Where can I read about this like in a fantasy setting or something? So we were just like, oh my gosh, we have like a big library full of books, so why not just recommend it to people? And we ended up creating an online like digital library with all our book recommendations to make it easy for people to, you know, have a read through, see what they might like. You know, it's full of like fiction, non-fiction, child-friendly books, and it's just another way of spreading the knowledge. A lot of these authors have gone into lots of research to create these books. Some of them, like I said, are fantasy books, so it's a form of escapism. Like, you know, we love Percy Jackson. There's Children of Blood and Bone. There's Skin of the Sea. Like those books, if I had them in my library growing up, I feel like I'd be a different person today. It's just that form of connection you get that you don't really get with, like, I don't know, reading Harry Potter or Percy Jackson, where the main character isn't like us or doesn't have our name.
And I think what we really like about when you read, you know, these fantasy books is I guess it's being able to see Black characters, complex Black characters in these sort of like really magical settings, steeped in culture. But then it also allows us to learn about culture in a way that's not, one, traumatic in the way that lots of people have been telling, you know, Black stories in most medias, because most of these sort of like authors, they're really playful with, you know, the characters that they create and the worlds building that they sort of do. So it's like these really beautiful worlds, these beautiful characters, and it's really empowering to sort of learn culture through them. And so that's why we're just so happy to be able to give a lot of these authors, you know, that platform to be able to shine even more, because more people deserve to read and sort of like see and experience these beautiful worlds, and to be able to center Blackness in the same way that it's been normal to have, you know, other sort of like white characters and sort of like other characters as the norm. But this time it's us being centered through the books. So yeah, shout out to the Black authors every time.
Yes, absolutely. And I love that you brought up normalizing it. It's true, you know, you don't read these in schools. I know you both are African, and, you know, growing up in America, I moved here when I was 9, and there was just nothing but whiteness. And I grew up in the US, I live in the US, and there was just nothing but whiteness. So now being able to explore, you know, all of these things, I also wish I had it when I was a child.
Yeah.
So it's amazing to know that our children and kids nowadays will be able to read and see themselves represented in art and in books. So thank you. And yes, shout out to those authors. So what's next? What's next for the both of you as a collective? Anything that we can look out for?
Oh, quite a lot. So we're working on a few new paintings. So we've been lucky enough to have some commissions with some museums and galleries in the UK, and I think that's a great next, like, big step into getting, you know, African mythology and African stories into the mainstream media, especially to an audience that is white, because they need to learn as well, right? They need to break their misconceptions as well. So we've been working on some new paintings that will be in some museums soon. So look out for that.
That's great. Yeah, we're also working on, I guess, books, because that's one of our next steps that we want to sort of get into as well.
Yeah.
To be, you know, published authors. So watch the space with the type of books that will be coming out soon. What else? Yeah, it's just literally, you know, we're still quite early in our art careers in terms of as artists. So sort of navigating that space and sort of, yeah, getting ourselves in more museums, more galleries to show the world. Because again, like 2 years ago, we had our first solo exhibition, and that was so successful because the impact that it sort of had on people who came down and said, it's so amazing to be able to see these in person, to be able to walk around it and experience it and be empowered by it. So we definitely want to be able to curate a new pieces to be shown to, you know, a lot more people.
Yeah, we'd love to come to the States as well, because that's where the majority.
Yes, come.
So
we love.
Definitely love to. And then also soon tour Africa as well, you know, the continent, and gather more stories.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a project that we really want to focus on as well.
Yeah, so and I think that's also so important. I think sometimes people feel like, well, these stories and these things came from Africa, so everyone in Africa must know it. And that's not necessarily true too, right? Right. So I want to pivot a little bit and just talk about, you know, the erasure of, you know, history, not just here in the West, but also in Africa. And I love that you brought up the idea of going to, you know, Africa and touring. Can you talk a little bit about that erasure and how your art kind of helps to fill in that gap, not just for us here, but also for family back home?
Yeah, I think what's really interesting is what we see is that it's not only, I guess, the diaspora who are sort of learning through the work that we do, because it's important to understand that, you know, there's a lot of post-colonial sort of like impacts that sort of happened on the continent as well. So a lot of people didn't get the chance to learn about traditional religions, traditional culture as well, because they've been so focused on, I guess, what's contemporary there, and a lot of, I guess, what we know as sort of like traditional religions, cultures, spirituality has been so heavily demonized that you wouldn't even want to associate with it. A lot of people on the continent don't want to associate with it. So all of that stigma, all of that sort of thought processes means that, you know, even people who have grown up in these sort of like communities, they wouldn't know a lot about a lot of the things that we sort of teach, and the sort of like the stories, the depths of them. And I think so that's important, to be able to sort of dispel a lot of the preconceived notions that they might have. Because you don't want to think that everyone knows sort of like everything just because they're you know, sometimes they only know what they've grown up with, and sometimes it's they're learning for the first time as well. So it's important to, have that education there as well. And so, so it makes sure that the stories that we're telling don't necessarily die out on the ground as well. So I would say it's also good to know that other people in the continent are learning about different parts of it as well.
Yes.
And it can be even as local as different tribes learning about similarities of different tribes. Like you'd think that a lot of Yoruba people know about Igbo mythology, and they don't. And they don't know how similar some of the concepts that they have might be. So it's good to have that cross-continental, cross-cultural understanding as well.
And it's really lovely to see live as well, because when we post things, we get comments from people from different areas of the continent being like, oh, we have something similar called this, or we have something similar but we call it this. And it's so great to see that, like, there's so much shared similarity throughout the continent, and there's so much that can bring us together if we're just willing to, like, learn about it. So yeah, it's great to see, honestly. It's really cool.
Yeah, that totally resonates. Like, as we know, Africa is not a monolith. So as you produce this art, from different countries, showing the similarities, though, is also really important in tying us together, especially in times when, the continent is very divisive. So yeah, I mean, it's amazing. The work that you're doing is so great. So it's just exciting, and we're excited to see how it continues to evolve. Our platform, like I said earlier, is really full of creators and creatives who are looking to take their art to the next level. So we try to talk to people such as yourselves who can give that advice and talk a little bit about their journey. So on that note, can you take us through a little bit about any difficulties that you've had, being Black creators, and especially exploring something that really hasn't been explored before? What has that feedback been like? And do you have any advice for our artists and art creatives that might want to venture into the unknown, kind of like you did?
Yeah, I mean, at first it was tough. It was really hard, like, especially with social media and getting, like, our art and our stories out there, because, like, a lot of people weren't really open to the idea of, African mythology. We were getting stuff like, oh, it's demonic, this is witchcraft, all that. We just had to keep, but we just had to keep pushing through, because we knew that, the end goal was bigger than, like, a few people on the internet saying things. And there was a few times at the beginning we were like, oh my gosh, life would be so much easier if we were just painting, like, Aphrodite or Medusa or something. Open to, like, learning about those characters. But we were like, it's not fair on, the continent. It's not fair on the rich stories that are in the continent if we at least don't try our best to use our voices in our art. But it was hard to push through. And even now, sometimes we get the odd comment, but it's just like, gotta educate them.
And even navigating, I guess, the art world as Black artists in such a niche space, honestly, it's difficult. Like we're not going to come here and say, or lie to anyone and say that it was an easy journey, or it is an easy journey. You do have to really advocate for yourself. You do have to accept rejections. Do a lot of work when you're not necessarily getting any rewards or instant gratification from it. There's lots of highs and lots of lows. Definitely being in a niche means that it's not as marketable as maybe some of your white counterparts doing the exact same thing or the bare minimum. So you have to work that much harder to sort of get into those spaces, to be able to get those opportunities. But when you stick at something and you're really passionate about it, the answer to that question of, oh, should we do this or dull down the message? It's always going to be no, because you know that the mission is more powerful than that. And the end goal will be worth it. And it's those individual lives that you get to really impact. And we get to see that impact through comments and through the people that we speak to. So that's why, your mission, the why, is normally really important. It's what's going to get you through those very difficult times.
For sure. And I'd also say, like, never give up, never stop creating, because you just don't know when that moment is going to happen, and your life will change. Because like we could have stopped and been like, oh, okay, like it's not working.
Many times.
But we just kept making art, and we just kept having that body of work, so that eventually when people did start catching on, we had so much artwork and so many stories to tell that it wasn't very overwhelming. Like so I think that was one good thing about what we did, for sure. Like just keep going. Like it's hard, but it's definitely all going to be worth it, for sure.
Yeah, honestly, just like on what Adeche was saying, is being consistent when things are low, when things aren't necessarily happening, because that body of work, that experience that you're getting, when you do get those eyes on you, when you do get that opportunity, that's when you get to show that backlog of work. You get that experience. You're able to confidently present yourself, able to confidently tell about your work, because you've been doing all of that beforehand. It's not that you just waited to get that big opportunity where you start. And that's not where you start. Everyone always says that, oh, it wasn't an overnight success. It took like 5 years in the making. That's what it is. It sort of takes all that time to be an overnight success. So do that work.
And what I really like about the two of you is how deeply you've immersed yourself in your work, and also that you didn't pigeonhole yourself into just one category. Like you are artists, but like you said, you're venturing into writing, and you have a podcast. So do you have any advice for creatives who might feel a little bit afraid to venture into other things? Like maybe they're just, artists and they just want to stay there. What advice can you give to creatives to just kind of give them that extra push that it's okay to try different modes of art, especially in today's era?
Yeah, I would say don't be afraid of failing, because failure can be your biggest opponent when you're trying something new. Just try it, because you never know. That's the thing. You don't know until you try it. And like for us, we didn't know we were good at podcasting until we tried it. We didn't know we could just tell stories without showing any of our art. And that alone was one big step we had to take, because a lot of people loved our art, and we were like, okay, we can't paint all these paintings, so we're just gonna have to stand in front of the camera and just tell people stories. And honestly, it was scary. We were like, oh my God, what if they don't like it? But you never know, and people do like that. So it's like, just don't be scared of failing. Yeah,
and I guess I would say, the whole idea of being a content creator, it can, to a lot of people, and I guess even to us when we first started, it's sort of the idea of, oh, would it be cringe? Would it be something that no one would see? Am I built for this? And the answer is, at the end of the day, what it is being able to communicate stories, is able to communicate yourself in different ways. And the content that you should create should be as authentic to you as you can, but feel free to learn new skills along the way. Because at the end of the day, the reason why you're creating your art is to be able to communicate it to yourself and to the world. And that's what you can use social media for, is communicating it to yourself first, because I'll tell you now, you watch your video more than anyone else.
Yes. That is true.
So you're communicating with yourself, it resonates with you, and then it resonates with the world. And at the end of the day, that's what you want your art to do. And you never know which different way you might have to do it to reach a certain person. And you don't know who you're reaching with this content that you're creating. So don't sort of miss out on such an opportunity just because you think you're not ready, or you think that no one will like it. Honestly, it's a consistency thing. So find a way to start, find a way to stay consistent with it, and then learn to enjoy that process through it. I think that's the...
And for everyone that will be watching this video, how do we support you? How can we support you? How can we stay in touch?
So we're on all social media at adeche.atelier. And YouTube as well. We just started our YouTube channel for longer form videos. So check that out.
And if you want to support, and you really want to support, there's Patreon out there as well. So,
Perfect.
you can support financially, you can support just by being there. And, you can support with words, nice comments.
Yeah.
We love a good comment,
Also buy our artwork.
Yes.
Right. I was going to say, right? I think we're missing the main one here, guys.
I was trying to get there still. Just around the corner, you just said, yeah, we also have, a lot of beautiful art that can decorate your rooms, really empower you, all that thing that we just said for the last.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, imagine having that bottling it up in your house as beautiful art that represents blackness, it represents us, it represents our culture.
Yeah.
You get to see really stunning pieces that really mean a lot to you and stories about your culture. So yes, buy some art as well.
Yeah. And the art can be purchased on your website, or where do we find it? On your
website, adeche.com. Yes. Very simple. ADECHE.
I say it like I'm editing, and I'll put it here.
I'll put it here. Okay, well, thank you so much. Thank you for taking the time to talk with us. It was very enlightening. And like I said, thank you for all of the work that you both are doing. It's so inspirational and it's so necessary, and you really are changing lives. So thank you so much. Yes, absolutely. And I hope to talk with you both very soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.